Hello, my name is John Sloan. I'm the Executive Vice President for NotSoSecure USA. I want to thank you for joining this exciting and extremely informative webinar, The Art of Hacking: Introduction to Web Applications. Before we get into the heart of the presentation, I want to first highlight a little bit about who we are. NotSoSecure is an intricate part of Claranet cybersecurity practice. Claranet, our parent company, is one of the largest managed service providers in Europe and abroad, focused on modernizing and running critical applications and infrastructure 24/7 for our customers. The Claranet cybersecurity practice has over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity services and training for some of the biggest brands across the globe. We are one of the largest training partners of the globally acclaimed Black Hat Conference, where we train hundreds of participants in cybersecurity every year. What differentiates us from our competitors in cybersecurity is we hack and we teach. Our teachers are our hackers, enabling us to provide the most researched and capable penetration testers in the market. As teachers, our hacker training program encompasses training that supports Hacking 101 for beginners, which are individuals with little to no security experience, all the way up to advanced, to include advanced infrastructure hacking, advanced web hacking. We also specialize in cybersecurity training focused on DevSecOps and hacking and securing cloud. This webinar is an introductory to our 2-day basic web hacking course. At the end of the webinar, we will provide additional information on how and where you can attend one of our specialized cybersecurity training courses. As hackers, we provide white box and gray box penetration testing services for your business applications, infrastructure, cloud, and mobile environments. Additionally, we provide successful black box red team security risk assessments where we leverage our hacking expertise to find vulnerabilities that vulnerability scans are not able to identify. I also want to note and emphasize on this slide, you can win a free place on our next live remote delivery class by speaking to one of our team members about your training or pen testing requirements. Further information regarding how to enter will be given at the end of this webinar, so please stick around to get that information. This wraps up a little bit about who we are. And now, without further ado, I welcome Pratik Shah, who is going to give us unique insight into cybersecurity through the attacker's eyes: Introduction to Web Applications. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to submit questions via chat throughout the session. We'll gather them and respond to them accordingly. Pratik?
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Let me begin with a quick introduction. My name is Pratik Shah, and I work at NotSoSecure as an associate director. I have around 9+ years of experience in an information security domain. In terms of accreditations, I do hold certificates like OSCP, ECSA, CCNA, CEH, CCNA Security, Novel Sentinel, Metasploit Specialist, and blah, blah, blah. Apart from this, I also like to contribute into an open source community. So I've written an exploit which has been accepted into a Metasploit framework. In my free time, I like to work on bug bounty. So I was former member of HackerOne, Cobalt, and Synact Red Team. Then I do like to write technical blogs. So most of my blogs are offensive in nature, where we talk about how we can compromise the web application which has been exposed over the internet, how we can chain multiple vulnerabilities, and how we can get the access to the underlying operating system. And then we also talk about what are the common vulnerabilities which you can identify over the network, over the infrastructure, and whatnot. So I've just given you the link of my blog in this slide. Before we begin with the technical part of this webinar, let me just quickly cover the certification pathway. So if you're pretty much new to this information security domain, then what we have done is we've created a foundation level certificate, which is Hacking 101. So this is a training which will talk about the basics of an information security. We'll go through the CIA triad, and we'll try to map multiple vulnerabilities, multiple exploits together to understand what information security is. Depending on your interest, then you can choose your certification pathway. You can either go towards the web application hacking or towards the infrastructure hacking. Depending on your expertise, you can go for basic web and basic infra. If you're pretty much aware of the basic stuff, then you can go for advanced web application hacking and advanced infrastructure hacking. Now, let's try to understand the course outline of this basic web application hacking. As I've already stated, this is an entry-level web application security course. In this course, our main objective is to understand the basic web application hacking related concept, understand the basic web application related attacks, and then perform those attacks using multiple tools. Just to make sure that our delegates are getting an hands-on experience, what we have done is we've created a vulnerable lab around this particular training. And our lab basically simulates the real-time application environment, where you will see that you have multiple functionalities which simulates the real-time application, and you are now trying to attack those functionalities. You're trying to identify the business logic flaws. You're trying to identify multiple vulnerabilities in that particular application. You may be curious, like, why am I here? What I can get once I do this training or once I complete this webinar. So if you are a penetration tester, you'll be able to understand and practice the hacking methodology. Then you'll be able to perform manual as well as automated attacks on the web application. You'll be able to perform a web application security assessment on the client web applications. You'll be able to understand the business impact of the findings which you have identified, and you'll be able to understand the concept of attack chaining, and you will come to know that how attack chaining can cause catastrophic events on that particular web application. If you are a blue teamer, if you are into a defense side, then you will be able to understand the mindset of an attacker and how attack chaining can be abused by an attacker to achieve the highest severity of that particular vulnerability. This and lot more is covered in our basic web application hacking course and lab. With this, let's quickly start with the technical part. Just to make sure that we cover most of these vulnerabilities in a proper flow, what we've done is we've created a scenario. So this is a hypothetical scenario. We are just going to assume that we have one client, and that particular client has given us an assessment of web application security. Our main objective is to perform an authenticated web application security assessment and demonstrate a real-time attack. During that particular engagement, we need to identify and exploit the web application related vulnerabilities, and then try to demonstrate like how we can access the sensitive data from that web application. Before we go into the attack part, let me quickly cover the hacking methodology. Most of the time, whenever we try to perform this web application security projects, our clients, they do come back to us and they ask us a question saying that how you make sure that you've achieved a good coverage on our web application. Just to answer that question, what we do is we just give them a quick walkthrough of this hacking methodology. This hacking methodology, what it does is it divides your pen test in 5 different phases. Most of the time, the pen test will start with enumeration and information gathering. So in this phase, depending on our approach and depending on our objective, our main area would be to identify the information about that application. It can be the framework level info, it can be the CMS level info, it can be the information about that particular organization. Once we gather this information, and depending on the information which we have gathered, then we'll try to identify the vulnerabilities or the misconfiguration which are related to that particular web application. Once you've identified vulnerabilities, then we'll try to exploit those vulnerabilities, and that is where your phase 3 will come into the picture. Now, exploitation is a very important phase of your pen testing. Depending on what kind of vulnerability which you have exploited, you may get an access to, let's say, internal infrastructure. You may get an access to the sensitive information. You may get an access to the AWS keys. So depending on the scenario which you are trying to exploit, you will then try to plan your post exploitation. Now, the post exploitation is a crucial phase of your pen test. Depending on the access which you've got, you may try to perform pivoting. You may try to extract the sensitive data from that backend database. Sometimes it may happen that you may need to use unavailable privileges to do pivoting, post exploitation, and all other activities. And that is where you again go back to the enumeration phase, and you will start to enumerate the internal infrastructure of that organization. Now, when we cover this particular hacking methodology multiple times, at one point of time, you will realize now you have highest possible privileges on that web application or on that infrastructure. That is how our hacking methodology helps us to achieve a good coverage on a client infra or on a client web application. Cool. So let's start with the basics. Let's talk about an HTTP protocol. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It is a stateless protocol. So when I say HTTP is a stateless protocol, by design, by protocol standard, every request response will be considered as an independent transaction, which means that your server will not be able to keep track of your actions or any user's actions, what he has done in the previous request. That is what the protocol standard says. So HTTP is a stateless protocol. Whenever we are communicating over an HTTP protocol, the major components which plays the communication role is request and response. Your HTTP client will always send a request and the server will send a response which is appropriate to that particular request. If we talk about the versions of an HTTP protocol, then we do have HTTP version 1.0, 1.1, and 2.0. Then there is a protocol called HTTPS, which is nothing but an HTTP over SSL. It's a secure communication. HTTP by default, it's a clear text protocol. So whenever you send the traffic over an HTTP, the traffic will go in a clear text format until and unless you have enabled an SSL over that HTTP. And that is where HTTPS will come into the picture. Let's quickly look into the structure of HTTP requests. Now, the major components which are being kept inside the HTTP request are nothing but method, resource, host header, then you have user agent string and cookie. Each and every component has its own significance meaning in terms of the web communication. Your HTTP methods, they play a major role of transferring data, sometimes fetching data from the web server. Then resource is nothing but the endpoint which you are trying to access in your web browser. Hoster is nothing but the domain of that particular URL. And then the user agent is nothing but the application which is trying to access that URL. Most of the time, the user agent will be your the browser version, and that will basically give an information to that particular application server that this device is trying to access the website. And depending on the device info, the browser, the server will try to load that page in that particular device. Every request, as I've stated earlier, it will have an appropriate response from a server if the request is being structured in a proper manner. Now, response, it does have multiple components, like you have a response code, then you have web server and application server type details, then you have cookie parameter, set cookie parameter, and then you have an HTML content which are being loaded inside your browser whenever the response comes from that particular server. Whenever we perform web application security assessment, the first and the tricky part of that particular engagement is to understand the attack surface of that web application. Now, attack surface, if you talk about the layman language, attack surface basically describes the different entry points which can be abused by an attacker to perform different attacks on those particular applications. Now, when we talk about these different entry points, it can be input field, it can be HTTP methods, it can be headers, it can be cookies. Sometimes you also need to understand the business logic of that application, and depending on that, the attack surface of that particular application may vary. So if you are testing a financial based web application, the attack surface of that web application may vary depending on all these inputs which we have just discussed. Next, very important thing which we need to understand whenever we are performing a web application security project is OWASP. OWASP stands for Open Web Application Security Project. It is a non-for-profit organization. So what they do is they basically collect data from the community and they basically list down the top 10 vulnerabilities which can be identified on the web application. Just for your reference, what I've done is I've basically listed OWASP Top 10 2013 and OWASP Top 10 2017, both the lists. If you look closely, you would notice that A4 and A7 from the 2013 list has been merged together and they've came up with a new name, Broken Access Control, and they've listed it inside OWASP Top 10 2017. They've also introduced 3 new vulnerabilities because they've identified that now these are the upcoming vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities, they do have serious impact on the web application. So they've basically added XML external entity related attacks, then insecure deserialization, and insufficient logging and monitoring in OWASP Top 10 2017. Just a key thing to note here is these are just top 10 vulnerabilities. These are not all the vulnerabilities. So what they do is they only list top 10 top common vulnerabilities which can be identified on the web applications. Now, let's talk about proxies in terms of a penetration testers perspective. So whenever we are performing a web security assessment, the major tool which will be used by the penetration tester is proxy. Now, proxy in terms of web application security, it works as man in the middle kind of tool. For an example, if you look at this snippet, let's assume that's our workstation and we are trying to access a website, let's say xyz.com. What we do is we basically start a burp proxy suite on our workstation. Whenever the request goes from the browser, it will be intercepted by burp proxy. And in Burp proxy, we can now modify the parameters of that particular request, and then we can forward it to the server, which means that for server, our Burp suite will become a client, and for client, our Burp suite will become a server. So that is why we say that the proxy tools are nothing but mind-limited kind of tools where we have a capability to play with the request and response which are being sent over the network. Let's quickly look into the Burp suite part. So this is just a look of Burp suite dashboard. This is how it looks. It is an intercepting proxy server that operates as man in the middle between browser and your HTTP server. We've already discussed about it. Our next demo is just going to be a quick walkthrough of how you can use Burp and how you can configure the Burp to intercept the traffic from your web browser. Right now, what I've done is I've basically created a malicious or a vulnerable web application, and this is our Burp suite, which I've ran on the same machine. By default, your Burp suite will listen on port 8080. This is a default proxy listener port. Whenever you turn on the intercept, which is under the proxy tab, and if you go back to your browser and if you just refresh the request, you will see that Burp is now able to capture that request. Now, the part which I'm highlighting is the method, then the resource, then the HTTP protocol version, then the cookie header. This is how your request would look like. Now, the next component which I would like to talk about is a repeater. Repeater is actually a module inside a Burp which has a capability to repeat same request again and again. For example, let's say I'm performing a pen test and where I want to just send same request by modifying the parameter again and again to the server. In that case, I can use repeater and I can easily monitor the response of that request. Another very important tool is intruder. We are going to talk about intruder in more detail in next few demos. Most of the time, whenever you're performing a pen test, you would see that that particular application has multiple third-party integrations. However, as a penetration tester, we don't have authority to perform pen test on those endpoints. In such scenarios, what we can do is we can basically define the scope of our testing, and we can configure that scope inside Burp. That is what I'm just showing. So how you can configure the scope and how you can limit yourself to only perform testing on that particular application. Right now, I'm just demonstrating the same thing again. We are just going to redirect to the login request. And here, if you look into the history tab, you will see that now we have login.php, which has been captured inside our history tab. Cool. So if we track back our progress, so what do we know so far? We've just understood the basic concept of an HTTP protocol. We've talked about what is request, what is response, what is the structure of request, what is the structure of response. Then we've looked into OWASP top 10. Then we talked about Burp proxy. I've just given you a quick idea of a hacking methodology concept. And then we've looked into the concept of an attack surface. Let's start attack. Now, the first part which we are going to discuss is an authentication, how you can identify multiple vulnerabilities inside a web-based authentication and how you can automate those vulnerabilities. First thing first, let's try to understand the concept of authentication. In terms of web application, authentication can be as simple as just you're taking username and password, or it can be a two-factor authentication where you're taking username and password plus you are basically sending an OTP to particular mobile device. Authentication is a mechanism of verification and validation of a user. In a common scenario, it can be just asking for username and password. Authentication also has different methods, like you have single factor authentication, two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. When we talk about multi-factor authentication, it is as good as you have a VPN authentication, then you have certificate-based authentication, then you're basically taking like two-factor authentication, and if required, you're basically checking for the biometrics. So because there are multiple layers of authentication which are taking place, we call this particular type as a multi-factor authentication. Now, what are the common authentication-based issues? Now, pretty common issue is username enumeration. Now, when we talk about username enumeration, the places where you can identify username is login page, registration functionality, and forgot password functionality. Sometimes it do happen that these functionalities, they reveal some info through the errors, which could lead to a username enumeration kind of issues. Now, how you can remediate against these vulnerabilities? Please make sure that you enable secure login error message. Make sure that your error message does not reveal any sensitive information. Try to redirect user and try to just give a message saying login failed, invalid user ID or password. Now, if we try to perform username enumeration with a manual approach, you would see that it will take a lot of time, and it is not actually a good investment of our time. And that is where the automation will come into the picture. Now, Burp has a module called Intruder, which is a very powerful and configurable fuzzer, which basically has a capability to define a payload position. Now, once we define a payload position, once we define that particular parameter that we want to attack on that parameter and we want to fuzz that parameter, then depending on our configuration, it basically can allow us to perform username enumeration. It can allow us to perform brute force attack if it is a password parameter. The best part of this tool is it can also allow you to extract exact phrase or exact word from your HTTP response, which can save a lot of time in our real-time pen test. And that is what our next demo is. In this demonstration, what we're going to see is we're going to first talk about a username enumeration vulnerability, which is there on the forgot password page. And then we are going to automate this username enumeration with Intruder. First thing first, I'm just going to enter an invalid name, and you will see that we're getting a message, no user account was identified with this particular username, which is an indication that, okay, this user does not exist. Now I'm going to type my name, Pratik. I'm going to just submit that name. Now, because this is a valid name, we are getting redirected to index.php with a message, success, email has been sent to your registered email ID. Now, at this point, as per an attacker's perspective, we now have a clear endpoint where we can perform this username enumeration kind of testing. First thing first, let's quickly go to forgot password functionality and let's try to intercept that request using burp. Now, as you can see, we've already intercepted this request. I'm going to send this request back to the repeater. And I'm going to first check the response of this original request, which has a username parameter as test. And you will see that we are getting 302 response with a location header as forgot password.php. I'm going to send this response to a tool called comparer. Then I'm going to modify this username parameter with valid user, that is my name, Pratik. Then I'm again going to send the same request. This time, when I get a response, I'm going to send this response back to the comparer. Now, we're going to compare these responses. This is the best part of this particular tool. So what it does is, it basically highlights the modified section of that particular response. It highlights the deleted part as well as the newly added part. If we look closely, now we have different location header for valid and invalid users. We can use this information for our intruder based fuzzing. So let me just send this particular request to the intruder. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to first select a parameter on which I want to perform this fuzzing. So this is a username parameter. Then I'm going to enter or add a payload list. You can basically copy paste the payloads in this particular dropdown. Then we are going to use a functionality called grep extract to extract the exact difference so that we can easily identify valid users of this particular application. And that is where our analysis of comparer will come into the picture. So what I've done is I've only highlighted the location header. Let me just quickly start the attack. Here you will see that there is a column called cache, which basically highlights the location header. And if we analyze our username and the response, you will see that the location header for valid username is index.php. And for invalid user, it is forgot password.php, which means now we have valid users like admin, user1, and user2. These are all valid users of this particular application. I'm just highlighting the same thing. For a valid username, the response basically has a location header index.php because it redirects you to that index.php. I'm just going to stop this attack. And this is how you can automate the username enumeration through Intruder. Okay, now let's assume that we've identified valid users of that application. What next? Now the next attack which we can do is attack on the password. For that, we need to understand like common issues which can be identified on the password parameter. So we have issues like password complexity based issue where your password is not that much complex and you are just accepting password as single character or 4 characters. You don't have any password complexity checklist or a validation place at the server end. Then there are issues related to the faulty password recovery logic. Then the issues related to password storage, like data at rest kind of scenario, where the passwords are being stored in the clear text format in the backend database. Let's talk about brute force attack. Now, when we have a valid username and if it is a single factor authentication, the next attack which we can try is online brute force attack on that particular login functionality. Whenever we are planning for an online brute force attack, the first thing which we need to do is we need to enumerate the username. This is the victim username which we are going to perform an online brute force attack on. Then, depending on our requirement, we can choose multiple tools. We can choose tools like Burp, Hydra. Sometimes these tools, they can give you an added or advanced features like you can force delays between your attempt so that it can help you to get or achieve the added level of stealth. However, keep in mind that these online attacks, they generate a lot of logs, which means that they generate a lot of noise. And it is bound to happen that if the client has a proper monitoring in place, these attacks can be flagged by the client SOC team. Our next demo is going to be on the front of online brute force attack, and we are going to use intruder to perform an online brute force attack on this Pratik user. First thing first, let me just log in with any random password and it will basically show us an error of login failure. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use Burp to intercept this request. Let me just enter the details. Let's go back to the Burp, start the intercept, and let's capture this request. I'm going to send this request back to the repeater. And here, if we send this request to the server, you'll see that we're getting a clear message of login failure or login failed. It's a 302 response and we're getting a message login failed. Let me quickly send this request to the intruder. And the first thing which we are going to do is we are going to define the payload position. Right now, I'm only interested in password parameter. Hence, I'm going to highlight that particular parameter and I'm going to set that particular parameter as the payload position. Then we are going to go to the payload tab and then we are going to just add a common word list or the normal word list. Again, the same thing, we're just going to perform a grep extract and we're just going to highlight this part so that our Burp will only flag or only filter down those results and it will just show us in the separate column. So if you look closely, you'll see that now we have a column of HTML and which basically clearly highlights that login failed message, which we have just selected in grep extract section. And for test @123, you will see that we got a message login successful. It is a clear indication that this particular user has a password as test @123 because we're getting that message. Let's quickly verify these credentials just to make sure that we are actually able to log in with this particular credentials in that user's account. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to navigate back to the login page and I'm going to enter these credentials. And as you can see, now we are logged in as Pratik. So what do we know? We basically talked about some of the common authentication related misconfiguration. Then we've looked into the Burp intruder. We've talked about username enumeration techniques. We've actually enumerated valid users of the application and we have performed brute force attack on that particular user. Let's talk about exploitation. And in this section, we are going to focus on client-side exploit. We are going to talk about cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is being called as XSS. It has been abbreviated as XSS because CSS was already being used. It allows an attacker to inject malicious HTML or a JavaScript code. It is actually a server-side error, but a client-side attack. when I say client-side attack, as an attacker, whenever you inject an HTML malicious code, that code will always be executed in a client browser. That's why we say that it's a client-side attack. XSS occurs when the user is able to submit a data, which is then directly written by the server without properly being sanitized. In effect, it is possible to craft a valid request that will result into a client-side code execution, which could basically allow us to execute malicious scripts in client browser. Now, if we talk about different types of XSS, then we have reflected XSS, stored XSS, and DOM-based XSS. Reflected XSS is an attack where it only affects a single user who is basically clicking on that particular URL. So as an attacker, we may need to change this particular vulnerability with phishing or with some other issues, and we may need to trick a victim to perform that action for us. Then and then only the script will be executed in his or her browser. On the other hand, we have stored XSS, which basically allows us to inject a malicious script which will be stored on a server. Whenever any user visits that functionality or visits that page, that script will be executed in the user's browser, and then it can basically allow us to execute malicious JavaScript code in the browser context of that particular user. Now, because the script is stored on the server side, we call this particular attack as a stored XSS. Then we have DOM-based XSS. It is a document object-based XSS, which basically allows us to define source and sink, and then we'll be able to perform this kind of attack on the victim user. Our next demo is gonna demonstrate how we can identify cross-site scripting, how we can enumerate cookies, and how we can exploit the browser of users using this cross-site scripting vulnerability. First thing first, right now what we are doing is we are basically trying to identify a point of reflection. So this V parameter, it basically gives us a reflection back into the browser. Now I'm just injecting an HTML code with an header syntax. So if this particular parameter is vulnerable to an HTML injection, what it will do is it will basically reflect back those tags, and our browser will basically treat that particular text as an HTML text. That is the reason we are seeing that particular part in a HTML syntax. Then let's go ahead and let's try to make things more interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enter a script tag. Whenever we enter a script tag, whatever which is between those script tags will be treated as a part of JavaScript. Let's try to retrieve cookies using document.cookie. Now document.cookie is actually a parameter which allows us to fetch the station of that particular window, and then it will basically show that station in an alert box. Let's quickly go ahead and let's try to enumerate the domain of this document. So this domain will be NotSecureApp.com because we are actually on that particular domain. Now the next thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to inject a URL of Beef hook. So Beef is a browser exploitation framework. What it does is whenever we identify a cross-site scripting like vulnerabilities, it basically injects a malicious JavaScript code which could allow us to hook that client browser. Right now, if you see, what I've done is I've just injected a source parameter inside my script, and I've basically injected that Beef hook as a source URL. Let's forward this request. And if everything goes well, then you would see that we are basically seeing the same version related tab. On the other hand, in my Beef server, I'm actually seeing a request from NotSecureApp.com, and if I scroll down, you will see that we are basically seeing multiple details like what is the browser which is being used by that client, then what is an operating system, what is a domain, what is the cookie of that particular user, session ID of that user. So all this information can be easily enumerated once you have a cross-site scripting attack. So cross-site scripting can also be chained with multiple vulnerabilities to demonstrate the severity of this particular issue. Okay, so after this, what do we know? We've basically talked about the different types of cross-site scripting. Then we've understood the concept of cross-site scripting, and I've given you a quick introduction of Beef browser exploitation framework. Next topic which we are going to discuss is SQL injection. And in this section, we are going to talk about how we can perform a manual exploitation of an SQL injection. First thing first, let's try to understand the concept of database. Database is nothing but an endpoint which basically allows us to store a data in a structured format. Now, whenever we are trying to query that data, we use a language called SQL, structured query language, which has the capability to fetch for that particular record which is there in the database, and it just allows us to get that record on our web browser. For an example, let's say I'm trying to purchase a laptop from xyz.com and I'm only interested in this particular module. Let's assume that this particular website has a search feature and I'm just entering this particular module. So whenever I enter this module, it will basically go to the application server. Application server will take that parameter from my request and it will put it into an SQL statement. Now, in this scenario, because this is a vulnerable server, what we have done is we've basically created a dynamic statement which allows us to exploit an SQL injection. So this database will basically fetch all the records for this XPS 15, and it will just print down all that data records in our web browser. That is where the attack part will come into the picture. Now, SQL injection, if you look at the concept of SQL injection, it allows an attacker to inject a part of SQL statement which can tamper the logic of backend SQL query, and which could result into the disastrous situation on a database. For an example, let's assume that we have a web application which has a username search functionality or username lookup functionality. Developer, what they've done is they've just used a simple select statement to query that username. So whenever you enter that username in that search functionality, it will just put that username directly inside a query, and it will basically try to query that user. If it exists on that database, then it will just give you the username, then the email ID and the date of birth of that particular user. Let's assume that I'm an attacker. So what I do is I enter this payload, single quote or 1 equal to 1. Now, at the time of query execution on the backend database, this query will execute like this: select star from users where username is equal to blank or 1 equal to 1. Depending on how you've implemented the data catch-up or data retrieval on that particular application, it may reveal the first record of that particular database, or it may just dump all the user database which is there in that particular table. Now, SQL injection, as I've stated earlier, it involves placing an SQL statement inside the user input. Now, the impact of SQL injection is pretty critical. So it can affect the confidentiality, it can affect the integrity, and it can affect the availability of your business or of your web application. Now, what are the types of SQL injection? So we do have multiple types. Like we have error-based SQL injection, which basically relies on the error messages, and it basically allows us to extract the information through the error messages which are being thrown by the database. Then we have union-based SQL injection. It uses an union operator, which is almost always supported by all the databases. Then we do have blind SQL injection, where no data is being displayed on the web page. We just need to rely on the logical operators to make sure that our query is in a true or false format, and that is how we can extract the data from the blind SQL injection. Then we have time-based SQL injection, where we use functions like sleep, wait, delay to basically extract data from the backend database. Then there are advanced types of attacks like out-of-band SQL injection, which are kind of rare. But in these scenarios, what you can do is you can basically use different protocol to exfiltrate that data to your server. In this section, we are going to talk about union-based SQL injection. It is mostly applied when the injection point is in a select query. So you have a select query and you have basically identified a parameter which is being used in that particular select query. If that application, if that parameter is vulnerable to an SQL injection, then in that case, you can rely on the union-based SQL injection. However, before we extract the data, we need to know the number of columns and their data types within the original query. The best part of this attack is, as I've already stated, union operator is being supported by almost all the databases. The best part of this attack is it works against all the databases. And your single query can result into bulk data extraction, which means that as an attacker, if we have identified a union-based SQL injection, we can basically achieve an added level of stealth on that network, because we can just send a single query which could result into bulk data extraction. Our next demo is going to be focused on an SQL injection, and we are going to first identify a parameter which is vulnerable to an SQL injection, and then we are going to perform a manual exploitation of that SQL injection. First thing first, let me just quickly log in. Now, post authentication, you would see that we have an offer page, and that offer page has multiple products. which is being reflected in the URL. So there is a parameter called ID parameter. What I do is the first payload which I use is R1 equal to 1. Now, because this is a numeric parameter, this payload basically will give me the complete list of products which are there on that site. At this point, we've just confirmed that this parameter is vulnerable to an SQL injection because our R1 equal to 1 query executed basically tampered the logic of backend query. Now, the next thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to enumerate the number of columns which are being used inside this ID query. So for that, we are going to use a union statement and union select 1, 2. The best part of this union statement is to use that union operator. The only condition which you need to understand is both the queries, the first query and second query, has to have a same number of columns. That is how we can enumerate the number of columns of that particular first query. Now, first query has 2 columns as I've demonstrated. Now we are going to enumerate the database name, and the database name is web1. After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just enumerate the user, and we are running with root at localhost user on that database. Let's quickly go ahead and let's try to perform a detailed enumeration, like what are the number of tables, what are the columns of those tables which are there. So right now I've just queried the tables from information underscore schema.table. So this is actually a schema data which is present in almost all the database. This query, once it is executed, it will basically give us a list of all the tables which are present in that database. And as an attacker, we are interested in this user table. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enumerate the column of this user table. For that, again, we are going to build a simple union statement query, and we are going to query the columns which are present inside that user table. And you will see that we have ID, first name, last name, password, username, email, registry date, and these many columns are present inside that user table. Let's quickly go ahead and let's try to identify the username and password. Let's try to dump those in our browser window. What I've done here is I've used a simple concatenation operation or operator, and we've basically queried ID, username, and the password hash which is there inside that database. And it basically dumps the complete data of all the users. Okay, so what do we know? We've basically understood the concept of SQL injection. Then we've talked about what are the different types of SQL injection. Then we focused ourselves on the union-based SQL injection, and we've performed a manual exploitation of union-based SQL injection. Okay, the next topic which we are going to discuss is web shell. And here we are going to talk about malicious file upload related vulnerabilities and how as an attacker we can change these vulnerabilities to perform a web shell upload. Now, what are the common issues which are there inside file upload? Sometimes you may come across a situation where your web application performs an insufficient checks, which could allow an attacker to upload malicious file. So when I say malicious file, it may allow you to upload HTML, SVG, XML files. It may allow you to upload multi-extension files. It may allow you to upload ICA related files, like which are virus related files. These could be abused by an attacker to perform different types of attack. Even in some scenario, your file upload functionality may also allow you to upload an web shell related files like .php, .asp, .aspx files. Now, what are web shells? Web shells are nothing but a simple code which provides us to interact with an underlying operating system through the web-based approach. So basically, they may include functions like system. They may include some other functions which are equivalent to executing commands on the underlying operating system, depending on the coding language, and they may allow us to interact with the underlying operating system by just injecting our command. Now, web shell can be written into PHP, ASP, JSP. There are multiple languages in which you can write a web shell. Web shell has the capability to traverse the directories. Web shell has the capability to modify, delete files from the application server. It can also allow you to execute SQL statement, execute code on that application server. Sometimes it may allow you to upload and download files. You may think that because web shell is doing a lot of these things, the code which would be treated as web shell can be complex in nature. Just to give you an idea, this is a code of simplest web shell which is available in PHP. So what we are doing here is we're basically using a command parameter. We're passing that parameter to the system function, and we're trying to execute that command using the system function on an underlying operating system. So this is just the simplest form of PHP web shell. Now, if you've come across a scenario where you have a malicious file upload and you have a PHP-based application, what you can do is you can just use this single liner or a simple web shell to confirm that vulnerability. And that is what our next demonstration is going to be. Now, in this demo, I'm going to show you how we can identify malicious upload functionality and how we can perform an interaction with an underlying operating system by uploading a web shell. First thing first, we have a file upload functionality under a profile tab, and here there is a image upload feature which allows us to upload an image. Now, just for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to directly upload a PHP file, and this PHP file is nothing but our common PHP web shell. I'm just going to highlight this request. Let's send this request. And now let's try to observe the difference in our profile. So once I upload this request, you would see that my image is shown in a broken tab. Let's quickly open that image location. Now, if I open that image location in the next tab, you will see that the image is being uploaded with myname.php. So they are not actually changing the extension. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to append a command parameter because that is what is needed to execute commands on the underlying operating system. And I'm going to type a command ID, which will basically give me the current identification of that particular user. Then uname-a will give me the architecture and the other information of that particular operating system. Then we can also cat to /etc/password file, which basically can give us the list of all the local users which are present on that operating system. Now, from this point onwards, what we can do is we can change this particular vulnerability. We can convert this web shell into an interactive shell. And then from that point onwards, we can perform pivoting, post exploitation. We can even try to compromise multiple machines which are part of the clan network. And then we can demonstrate the severity of this particular attack. Okay, so after this, what I've been learned and what do we know? So we basically understood the common misconfigurations which are being identified in a file upload functionality. And we've talked about web shell. We've basically demonstrated like how we can abuse the malicious file upload functionality and how we can upload the web shell on that particular web application. And then we've demonstrated like how we can execute commands using that web shell. Okay, now because this was just a webinar, what I've done is I've just covered bits and pieces of our training. If we talk about the complete syllabus of our BWH training, then these are the modules which we cover. So we start with the basics of an HTTP protocol. We go into like how HTTP protocol works, what are the different RFC standards, how you can use Burp proxy, what are the different modules, different components which are there in Burp proxy, how you can enable yourself to perform an automated kind of attacks using that particular Burp tool. Then we go into the information gathering. We basically stick to an hacking methodology. We try to talk about how you can gather the information using passive enumeration technique, using active enumeration technique. We talk about different tools, different techniques, which can allow you to enumerate information from a web application or of that particular client. Then we talk about username enumeration and faulty password reset. We basically focus on some of the common vulnerabilities of authentication. Then we talk about issues with SLTLS. We basically go into the SLTLS protocol. We try to understand the communication, how it happens, what are the different steps which are being taken place in SLTLS communication. We talk about some of the common misconfigurations. Then we focus on authorization bypass, where we talk about what is an authorization bypass, what are the different types of attack like business logic bypass, IDOR, then direct object reference. We basically perform different exercises around these type of vulnerabilities. Then we focus ourselves on cross-site scripting. We we basically perform exercises around how we can hijack the session of victim user, how we can get the cookies of that particular victim user. Then we talk about cross-site request forgery. And after that, we extensively cover an SQL injection where we go into pretty depth of database. We talk about how SQL statement works. Then we try to perform manual exploitation of the SQL injection. Then we give you an introduction of an automated tool like SQL Map. We talk about how you can automate that SQL injection exploitation, how you can create a query which can help you to reduce the noise of your attack on that particular web application or on that particular network. Then we talk about XML external entity related attacks. After that, we go into the insecure file upload. Then we also talk about deserialization related vulnerabilities. We basically focus on PHP based deserialization, and we demonstrate how this deserialization vulnerability can result into a remote code execution. With this, I'm just going to hand it over back to John. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Pratik. Before we get into Q&A, as previously mentioned, the Art of Hacking Introduction to Web Applications webinar is a precursor to our basic web hacking training course. If you have a need to gain greater knowledge regarding pen testing, red teaming, and overall how to better manage and resolve vulnerabilities in your IT environment, then this course on basic web hacking is a critical first step towards you reaching your objectives. Coming up in September and in October, we will be delivering our basic web hacking course via live remote training classes. I'd like to point out, in appreciation for attending this webinar, we are offering an additional 20% off if you register for one of these classes within the next 48 hours. These next few slides highlight additional available courses and upcoming webinars. These are also available to view on our website under events. If you guys want to just go through that. As previously mentioned, there is a webinar prize drawing. To arrange your call and gain entry to the prize drawing, please email us at contact@notsosecure.com, and we will follow up with you in short order. As a reminder, we teach and we hack. If you're in need for or have future needs for a cybersecurity risk assessment, we'd be super grateful to discuss that as well. We will be providing additional information via the email you provided, and we look forward to speaking with you in the near future. So thank you. We now open it up for Q&A. Please use chat to ask your questions, and we'll start off with first question, and I'll hand it over to you, Lizzie.
Hi, thank you there. Thank you, Pratik, for that really interesting and informative presentation there. I really enjoyed it myself. So we have had a few questions in, which is great. So I'll just get asking them. If you do have any questions, like John said, then please just send them over to us and we can ask them for you. So one of the questions we've just had in now is, what are the skills that are needed for this for these courses specifically? So what are the skills needed for the web hacking course?
Now, because this is a basic web application hacking course, there are no mandatory requirement. You can just start like pretty basic knowledge of IP address and only web communication. But that is, again, that is not mandatory. You can just start anytime. It does not have any hard and fast requirement.
Okay, great. And another question is that we've had through is, after I've taken the course, what would be the next step and the next course available for an ethical hacker?
Okay, so for that, let me just quickly go back to our certification pathway. So if you take this basic web application hacking course, and if you're interested in a web security part, then the next course which I would suggest is advanced web application hacking. If you are into an offensive part, if you are looking for a defensive courses, then we do have AppSec for developer and DevSecOps, which are again good courses if you are trying to defend against these attacks.
Great, thank you for that. And another question we've had into is, what is specifically the lab access that you offer?
So we do offer 30 days lab access. So you will be able to perform like different attacks in our lab, and our lab, it does have some of the hidden crown jewels which you can just find in your lab access time. Great,
thank you. And another question we've had in, what are the tools Burp Suite has? And do you understand what I mean there, Pratik?
Yeah. So
great.
I think the question was, what are the different components which Burp has? So now, yes, in a demo, what I've shown you is the Burp community version. So it has intruder, then it has sequencer, it has comparer, it has repeater. Then you can basically enable multiple extensions depending on like if the extension is available for community edition, then you can use like logger plus plus. Then you can use like multiple extensions to automate these attacks. But if you have a commercial version of Burr, then it may open like a lot of doors for you. So you can just go through the BWH store and you can download the extensions like download scanners. Then you can download the extension like deserialization scanners, file upload scanners, and there are n number of extensions which are really good as per penetration test perspective, because they basically try to save your time which you're spending in a manual assessment. You can basically automate those extensions to achieve your end goal. You basically, as a penetration tester, you know what kind of vulnerability can be identified, and then you basically configure that extension to verify that vulnerability. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Another question we've also had in is web page defacement taught during this course? So the web
page defacement can be a result of cross-site scripting. So phishing can be done through cross-site scripting. So if I say yes, I would not be lying, but we do not exactly talk about web page defacement. We just go far ahead from that. We basically talk about how we can inject a malicious script inside the client browser, and from that point onwards, how we can control the browser of that particular user, and if possible, if we have identified, let's say, a vulnerable Flash plugins, then how we can inject ourselves, how we can get a reversal from that particular client machine. Again, we only theoretically talk about these things. We do not demonstrate this inside our lab. We only try to stick to the concept of this attack. Like, what is the core concept? Why it happens? What kind of attacks can happen using cross-site scripting?
Great, thank you for that, Pratik. And another question we've had in is there any advantages in C language in binary exploitation or web hacking compared to Python? Do you
I don't think so, because C language binary exploitation, it's a complete different pathway. When we talk about these web application, even if the application is being developed in, let's say, Ruby on Rails, or you are using Node.js, now you do have framework specific vulnerabilities, and every component which is an IT component which has some kind of network communication, they do have some protocol specific vulnerabilities or some version specific vulnerabilities. The major takeaway from this course would be, we are trying to identify logical flaws, we are trying to identify the mistakes which are being done by the developer, which could result into these vulnerabilities. So having a knowledge to C, C++, or Python is good to automate these things. Basically, you can now just try to write your own script, which can work as intruder. You can try to write your own fuzzer, which can work as a cross-scripting validator. And then that is how it can help you, like your coding language or your coding expertise can help you to perform these engagements in a quick manner.
Great. Well, that is all the questions that we've had for today on the webinar. So I just want to say thank you again to Pratik, really good webinar there, and thank you to all of us for joining too. We would really appreciate it. We've got a survey at the end of the webinar that will come up. If you, we'd be grateful that you can fill that out for us. We really want to improve the webinars for you, and also it enables us to find out whether you are interested in the prize draw to win a free training place. So yeah, thank you again. I hope you have a lovely day or evening wherever you are in the world. And yeah, we hope you join us next time for our other webinars too. So thank you all again. Speak to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye.